One of the more profound things that I ever heard in my career is in an interview with Archbishop Desmond Tutu 2 years ago. I asked him if he was an optimist about South Africa, and he'd been very critical at the time of what was happening in the aftermath of Mandela's passing and then a few years. And I said, "Are you optimistic about the future of this country?" And he said, "I am not an optimist. I am a prisoner of hope," which is a very different kettle of fish, unquote.
I am very excited about this special bonus episode. FulStories strives to promote fascinating and unique storytellers who have, at some point in the last 60 years, served on the front lines of U.S. soft power efforts around the world. Their stories are often unknown, and, well, that's where we come in. This episode features Fred de Sam Lazaro, who 3 decades ago created the Undertold Stories Project, which has brought countless stories from some of the most remote parts of the world into the living room of PBS NewsHour viewers and to college journalism students. We're definitely kindred spirits, but Soft Powerful Stories has a long way to go to be in Fred's league. Pablo Picasso once said that good artists copy, great artists steal. And if you listen closely to Fred's vision, you might see glimmers of what we are striving for here.
Soft
power.
Powerful.
Soft
Power.
Powerful stories.
Powerful.
Soft
Powerful. Stories.
My ancestry is in Goa, which was a Portuguese colony in India. My parents had Portuguese nationality. There wasn't much to do in Goa, which took my family to Shanghai pre-war, and they were expelled after the war, the revolution there. Settled in India, which is where I was born, grew up there. And my mother was convinced, she was a widow by the mid-70s, that India was going the way of China, which confiscated my father's career in that revolution. He was a businessman and a fairly successful one. And so she decided to emigrate to the United States in the 1970s. Started in the San Francisco Bay Area, where my sister at the time lived, and she was the anchor that brought the rest of the family here, if you will. I spent 4 years there before moving to Minnesota.
Still, I wonder how someone from India, southern India, could survive a Minnesota winter.
Yeah, well, it tells you a lot about what humans do to adapt to whatever their environment is giving them. And I've seen this. I would hardly compare myself by a mile with instances of human endurance that I have seen, whether in Darfur and other places that have seen such extraordinary upheaval. It all depends on the motivation. I was in love, and I was able to afford a coat and some gloves and learned how to drive on ice.
And I, in turn, spent 2 years in Chennai, and I survived.
I was really attracted to journalism in part, and there may be more sinister explanations for it. The one that I like to reflect on is what impressed me as an adolescent. I lived in India during the emergency, which you may or may not recall from your time in Chennai. And it was quite a jolt to see a country that was suddenly transformed from being a chaotic democracy to being one in which the press was being muzzled and opposition leaders imprisoned. And I had a mentor who was a journalist, and learned a lot from him. And I remember one Indian publication that published on its front page the day that censorship was imposed. It published a blank front page, just the masthead and a blank page. And the combination of those two just impressed upon me how journalism can hold power to account and powerful people to account. And I found that mildly thrilling. And I'm the only member and the first member of my family to become a journalist. Most of them have more orthodox or normal professions.
You have such limited time on the airwaves, and you're proposing to do stories from very, very far away places about obscure things that producers might think their listeners aren't particularly interested in.
I think journalism, requires only curiosity, the desire to tell stories, and that's a skill that you build over the course of your career. And then you make stories more interesting by making them relevant to your audience. One of my strengths, I dare say, by virtue of my background, is that I grew up in India. I grew up in a developing world, and I subsequently grew up in the developed world. I lived in the Bay Area. I lived in Minnesota. I was enculturated in both places, and so had an easier time making the foreign less foreign to the audience. Most of the stories that we tell on the Undertold Stories Project are very interesting to the audience simply because they see the humanity that is shared there. It is there, but by the grace of God, might I have been in a story. And that's what makes a story interesting. And colorful characters, strong characters, really drive the narrative in a lot of our pieces.
Can you tell me what your idea of an undertold story is?
It's a genre. It's the kind of reporting that, is almost non-existent in legacy media anymore. Every one of these in the research phase will hit me as being, wow, I didn't think of it with this framing from this perspective. We did a story, and we've done it twice in follow-ups, out of Israel, Palestine, on water. We've seen a lot of coverage of the Middle East, and it's a very, very complex history. It's a very, very complex story to cover, especially if you're not resident, if you're not in the space all the time and absorbing all of it. And even then it's difficult. That becomes only possible when you can find a small story to tell the bigger one. And the one that I learned about was how water differentiates the welfare of Israelis versus Palestinians, how water sharing is conducted, and comparing the settlements, for example, on one side of the road in the West Bank to the other side of the road, where the Palestinians live. And you've got, the biblical prophecy of making the desert bloom on one side, and you've got desert on the other side. It's so stark. And so people can see the small story of how a scarce resource drives conflict. That is an undertold story because it helps people understand, these are the elements that drive, larger conflicts, that explain them, that aggravate them, and that might lie at the root of the conflict. I'm always amazed at resilience that lies deep in every human being, I'd like to think. We're lucky in that some of us in the more privileged part of the world aren't required to call up these reserves. But I have seen people, against odds that just seem so improbable, manage. We were the first television crew to go into the Darfur area in 2004, for example. And I, we talked to mothers who carried children and had others in tow and walked 6 days with nothing, just looking for safety, survived on berries. When we first got to the eastern Chad region where these folks were fleeing, UNHCR barely had tents for 40% of them. People were sleeping under the sun and starving, but they did what they needed to do. I've seen that in so many different theaters. You also see people bring out the generosity that I think is innate in most of us in times of crisis. And you see ingenuity. And I've seen a lot of that. Whether you can convert that ingenuity into something large scale is the key question that needs to be addressed in all development work. The world is just awash in fantastic ideas. You remember the tire-shaped water jug, that women could wheel behind them instead of carrying this heavy thing on their lids. That was a thing 20 years ago. What happened to it? It wasn't scaled. The playground in which kids twirl this merry-go-round and that pumped water up into a tank. What happened to that? The world's full of great ideas, and some do not scale. And that's the key question that dogs the whole business of development in many ways. Why is it that these things don't sustain themselves? And what are the gems that do? And that sort of defines, what we try to do at the Undertold Stories Project, because a lot of our work is about poverty and human suffering, and what ideas are gaining traction and scaling.
Do you think that there's a relationship between the kind of localization factor? Things that come from the source tend to last longer?
I think the consensus is that, yes, you need to have a lot of buy-in and a lot of participation by local communities, the people that have long been called beneficiaries in development work, if you're going to get any success. But, as we found in a series we did about USAID, remember them? What evolved was top-down and a lack of localization. I hope to go back to Ghana in particular in this instance, where we found a number of social enterprises that wanted nothing to do with USAID. At the time, USAID was still a thing. I'd love to go back and see whether they missed them at all. And I'm no expert. I'm not weighing in on any part of USAID's dismantling. That's nothing I know anything about. I don't want to touch the political aspect of it, but I will say that there were a lot of people who were very dedicated servants to USAID who I did happen to meet and watch them work in many theaters, particularly in global health. And that will probably be the greatest impact, in many minds, a very negative impact of USAID's dismantling, the removal of a number of global health initiatives. And we most recently reported on what's happening to the tuberculosis program in Bangladesh, where the plug was essentially pulled on a promising initiative that had a lot of local partnership. A lot of the global health had more localization. PEPFAR was 70% localized. And it's no coincidence that many experts called PEPFAR successful because of that.
I guess this report on USAID was a 3-part report that came out maybe a couple of weeks before the inauguration, and that it had been cited as kind of proof positive that the dismantling of USAID was a justified activity. What did you think about that?
Not much, because obviously it was 2 sentences lifted out of context. And so it wasn't the whole story by a long shot. We thought it best not to respond to it because that just gets you into a cesspool, frankly. And I had no interest in doing that.
You must have seen in your time some really inspiring examples of this kind of foreign assistance.
I'll talk about different kinds of foreign assistance, with assistance in quotes. In some cases, it's just pure humanitarian urges. And we've seen that very impressively from the U.S. government. I remember being in the aftermath of the tsunami in Sri Lanka, people just being in utter awe of the sheer prowess of the U.S. Marine Corps, which came in to help. They said we'd never seen anything like it. And that was American military power doing the softest thing. I'll give you another example, which was the earthquake in Kashmir in 2004, which killed something like 70,000 people in an extremely remote part of the world. And I think it's the Hindu Kush Mountains. It was just impossible to get there unless you were in these massive helicopters that the U.S. military had. They started to redeploy them from Afghanistan to Pakistani Kashmir to do rescue work. These were the only things that could get bulldozers into those mountainsides. It was very successful, both on the ground and in winning the hearts. The U.S. government, the U.S. military built an 80-bed hospital in less than a week. It commandeered every South Asian in the U.S. military who had any language competence to come to this hospital and run it. And it was one of the most spectacular things I've ever seen. A U.S. military hospital where almost all of the staff, from doctors to the people who wanted you as you came in for security reasons, almost all of them spoke Urdu, the local language. This was the U.S. military. It was a very proud moment in many ways.
I was in Chennai for the tsunami, but then I got assigned to Islamabad to take journalists up into the mountains. And those were the Chinook helicopters that we were in. And it was oftentimes U.S. military personnel, USAID, State Department, myself, foreign correspondents, people from NGOs, and they would only put the foreign correspondents on if there was room. If the food and the tents and the life-saving medications left room, then you could squeeze a few people on. And here's my undertold story for you. We were sitting in the middle, on the top of a hillside that had just been ravaged, just not a single building standing, and unloaded all the tents, the medication, and there was just a little bit of time while we waited for the helicopter to come back and get us. Well, if you remember, it was Ramadan. And while we were waiting, the villagers who had just suffered these horrible losses and who were fasting cooked us corn in oil over an open fire and gave it to us as an act of hospitality, which to me has always been one of the most, I think, powerful moments in these kinds of situations.
Yeah. No, that's a testament to, what SoftPower can do and what, how people were revered. The anecdote you just related about loading the helicopter, arriving in this place and describing what it was like for people to accept, to provide all this hospitality to you. Those very basic humane exchanges make for interesting stories. Sometimes they're just funny anecdotes. I can remember being with Jimmy Carter deep in South Sudan, which is a very difficult place to get around in. And this was a village, 2 hours away from Juba, which, in St. Paul, Minnesota would take me, 10 minutes to get to because of infrastructure. But there was Jimmy Carter, inaugurating an effort to use these filters for drinking water. The village had arranged a huge celebration for him, and part of it involved giving President Carter a beautiful cow, a bull actually. And this was a gift, and it was a beautiful, full-grown animal that people were salivating over, actually, but it was a gift to President Carter. And so he goes face to face with this cow and these people around him, and he says, does it have a name? Yeah, when you're in these exchanges and the protocols, what exactly do you say? And I think it was just hilarious to hear, Jimmy Carter was out of words to talk about this cow, which would soon be slaughtered and distributed to the whole village. We said, does it have a name? I don't know how that got translated, but it just floored me. You think about these very tiny little anecdotes and incidents, and those bring home to an audience, I think, what it's like to be in places, to meet people, that are so foreign to you in every way, in the way they live, in the way they look, and their material condition that you are trying to help in many cases if you're working in development.
Are there stories that you really, really want to tell that you're still chasing right now?
Oh, probably a long list. I'd love to go into parts of Borneo. I'd love to go to North Korea. I'd love to go to... Most of the places I really want to go to are very difficult to get into because it's hard to get a visa, and it takes moving mountains to do that. Prime example of, telling these undertold stories or telling a larger story from an undertold perspective As I remember, 1999, which marked the 50th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, we went to one family and 3 generations. The grandparents, were there at the revolution and talked about their sacrifice. The middle generation talked about the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and the enormous suffering. And the youngest, the progeny of that generation, emerging into a global superpower with enormous career prospects. And it was just one family that told you a lot about where China had started and where it was going in 1999. That's a story that I want to bring forward one more time and write a new chapter.
What gives you hope? I know it's kind of a cliche question, but I'm really, given your background in the 60-some countries you've reported from, what makes you hopeful?
I come back to the reserves that I want to continue to think we all have, the resilience and the reserves that we can call up when need be. I've seen a lot of people suffering, but I would never call these people pathetic in their condition, because they didn't allow themselves to be in pathetic situations. They were seeking to address a problem. Primarily, how do they provide for their children? That's the one thing that really deeply touches you. There's a dichotomy between adults and children. And when you see children suffering, that really, really, really hurts. If I've been affected personally, very viscerally frequently, it isn't seeing children suffer. But even children, learn to adapt what the reality of their environment is presenting to them on any given day. What gives me hope? I get frequently to tell these stories as solutions-oriented narratives by talking to people who are attacking these problems, who manage by really delving deeply into local cultures, local mores, in ways non-judgmental, able to bring change. I'm thinking, for example, of Molly Melching, who started an organization in Senegal in the 1990s, but she'd been there since the 1970s, went there as a Peace Corps volunteer, and she's still there. And she founded a group called Tostan, which was originally intended to be an education project to teach Senegalese children to learn to read and write in Wolof. What a concept. And not in French, which very few people actually speak, but was the official language. And that evolved and evolved. And long story short, Tostan has enabled thousands, 10,000 villages across 8 countries to abandon female genital cutting in ways that were not prescriptive, but just informational and educational, allowing women in ways that didn't threaten, that didn't shame, allowing communities to abandon. It's an approach of abandonment versus eradication that gave you, success. It's gone on to write textbook, children's books in Wolof. It just continues to evolve in many ways. And you see, some remarkable instances of that. The organization BRAC in Bangladesh has seen enormous growth. It is the largest NGO in the world, and it's got its fingers in just about every aspect of development in Bangladesh. There was a Catholic priest I knew way, way long ago in the 90s in Detroit, the inner city of Detroit, who started an organization called Focus Hope that was able to give hope to thousands of students that the Detroit public schools had essentially kicked out as incorrigible. And they managed to offer 2 out of 3 of these dropouts really productive careers in the automotive industry. And that's grown and grown. So I think in the most adverse of circumstances, you find, in particular, innovators come to the fore and bring about ideas, perhaps because there's nothing else to do. But I've seen some breathtaking innovation in places that you would think would be horrifically distressed, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa, India, or Detroit.
Well, even though it's a bonus episode, Fred cannot escape the inquisitiveness of our Aunt Deb.
I'm pretty clear on how all of this benefits them. But explain how it benefits us.
I mean, there are innumerable examples of the implicit self-interest in so much of the soft power that is wielded by the U.S. government. The cultural imprint of the United States globally is without peer anywhere, whether it's Hollywood, for better or worse, or otherwise, or just the footprint that USAID, with all its warts, had in so many places. It's enormous. I mean, the impact by sheer size is enormous, and it accrues to America's benefit in many minds. People will tell you, by creating business partners out of dependent nations. India being a primary example. You know, if you look at the India that I left and the India that's there today, and the trade relationship between India and the United States, I mean, that would be Exhibit A. The goodwill that it brings, the infectious disease that it wards off, and many experts will tell you, that we are in a world where we are going to have to scramble for resources, and we are competing in America, with other powers for these resources. And the inequity of dealings in sub-Saharan Africa notwithstanding, that is where a lot of the resources lie. And there needs to be a foundation of good relations to enable the United States to be competitive in that world. That is what I hear a lot. And again, I'm always attributing to people, I know very little beyond the experiences that I've had, but I listen to people who have, profoundly meaningful insights into these, into these larger issues and questions. I can speak as a young Indian boy growing up in Bangalore, which at the time was a small city, where Peace Corps volunteers, when I was a kid, would come, for their R&R. And my mother, would cook nice beef steaks for these boys. They were boys at the time, which was something that they would otherwise, didn't get in the villages where they worked. And it was in gratitude for people who gave, selflessly of themselves. I think there's a lot to be said for this kind of soft power that was done simply because it was a good thing to do.
Fred de Sam Lazaro is the executive director of the Undertold Stories Project, a program that combines international journalism and teaching at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He has served with the PBS NewsHour since 1985 and was a regular contributor and substitute anchor for PBS's Religion and Ethics Newsweekly. He has also directed films from India and the Democratic Republic of Congo for the acclaimed documentary series Wide Angle. Fred has reported from 62 countries, from Haiti to sub-Saharan Africa to South Asia. He has focused on stories that are underreported in the mainstream U.S. media. Fred was born in Bangalore, India, and lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, with his wife and 3 children. To learn more about Fred's reporting, please visit undertoldstories.org. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it. If you haven't followed us already wherever you get your podcasts, please do so. Please leave a rating. It means a lot to us. And not only that, but it helps get those algorithms moving this show to the ears that need to hear it, or that we would like to hear it. You can find out much more by visiting our website at softpowerfulstories.org. There you can learn more about our guests, see pictures of them in action, find out the music that we use, and, of course, leave feedback. We would love to hear from you. Our show's logo was designed by Kate Furby, and my friend Kathy Zilski voices dubious Aunt Deb, who, of course, she is nothing like, but she does it perfect. My name is Christopher Wurst. I'm the host and producer of Soft Powerful Stories. Until next time.